scene.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so welcome everybody who's there right now, and welcome to our panelists and our keynote to today's webinar on tax justice, corruption, and natural resource governance provided by JENA. Well, there's not much I want to say, actually. I will be your moderator for today. My name is Magdalene Silberberger. I'm professor of development economics at Witten University in Germany. I'm doing research on the impact and the determinants of illicit financial flows, and I'm very excited to have and to see many listeners and viewers here. And I'm hoping for an exciting discussion and exciting talks by our panelists and our keynote. And with this, I would like to start and hand over to David Robinson, who's Regional Anti-Corruption Officer at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, based in Nairobi, Kenya. His specialty is international criminal law, anti-corruption, and justice reform. So I think we have an expert in the particular field of illicit financial flows, corruption, and tax justice. Welcome, David Robinson, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you for that extremely generous introduction, Magdalene. And just out of interest, I think you're one of the few people I've met in my global travels who has the same first name as my wife. So you have something.
That's a very fortunate coincidence.
As well, so good afternoon, everyone. And I'm not sure I'm going to fit the bill of an expert in quite the way Magdalene describes very generously, but I'll see what I can do. So it's obviously a great pleasure to be asked here to deliver a keynote speech for this afternoon's webinar on the theme of illicit financial flows for sustainable development in Africa. Now, I've been given, I think, 15 minutes for this speech, so I'll do my level best to avoid what former US President John F. Kennedy termed the art of diluting a 2-minute idea within a 2-hour vocabulary. I'll instead endeavour to follow the sage words of Dorothy Sarnoff and make sure that I finish speaking before my audience has finished listening. So we start by asking a question, and that's, what does the phrase illicit financial flows actually mean? Well, there's no universally accepted definition of IFFs or illicit financial flows. The phrase is not defined by, nor does it appear in the UN Convention Against Corruption or the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. But broadly speaking, they're a kind of subset of illicit finance. So illicit finance that crosses international borders. Now, while domestic organized crime, corruption, and tax evasion are obviously significant, it's the flows of money from one jurisdiction to another that are of great importance, particularly to the developing world. I think one thing we can readily agree on is that flows of illicit finance would largely be stemmed if we tackled corruption, and in particular, the kind of organized corruption that has bedeviled significant parts of the world, not just the developing world. You know, before joining the UN, when I was a criminal lawyer in the UK, we referred to the money which criminals secured through their illegal activity as proceeds of crime. And I think I prefer that phrase. Illicit financial flows has a kind of sophisticated ring to it, which is appealing. But I think it somehow sort of masks the fact that what we're really talking about, for the most part, is ill-gotten gains from criminal activity. And I think the people who commit these crimes really deserve to be thought of as criminals. Proceeds of crime is in fact the same phrase as used in the UN Convention Against Corruption. It is perhaps a reflection of when it was drafted in the early 2000s. Now, obviously, proceeds of crime are proceeds of crime, regardless of where the money in fact ends up. And while some of it remains in country, it also leaves the jurisdiction in which the crime took place. And of course, more often than not, it's not conveniently stored in a bank account registered in the name of the same individual or individuals who are being prosecuted. Frequently, the money is hidden, and it takes a lot of effort to trace and retrieve it. And I should know, because that used to be part of my job. It requires a lot of work for finding money that's been hidden in this way. As recovery generally is difficult, and every jurisdiction needs to get better at it. We need to get better at it because if we're going to stop illicit financial flows, we need to discourage them from happening. And the best way of doing that is to make it not worth the criminal's while. Globally, it's estimated that we recover less than 5% of criminally obtained assets. So we're really not doing a terribly good job, even those of us who think we are. Now, of course, the loss of public funds hurts developing nations more than it does developed nations. So perhaps the imperative to get better in those developing nations is greater still. And I can't stress enough the need for great international cooperation between jurisdictions is a critical factor in this. If we're talking about the transfer of money, the flow of money from one jurisdiction to another, the only way we can effectively trace that and retrieve it is through good international cooperation. Progress is being made. So I've been here in Kenya for the best part of 2.5 years. And during the year 2018 to 2019, the National Anti-Corruption Authority, called the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission in Kenya, recovered 3.1 billion Kenyan shillings of assets stolen by criminals and corrupt officials, and that's over 29 million US dollars. So quite a significant amount of money. The EACC has also in place a number of what are called unexplained wealth orders before the courts, and they're in the sum of 10 billion shillings, which is over 100 million US dollars. Now, UWOs, or unexplained wealth orders, are quite a new tool, but they're really powerful in the fight against corruption. I won't go into detail in the course of the speech, but feel free to ask questions about this later, and I'll more than happily talk about them. It's a bit of a pet subject of mine. I'd certainly urge everyone listening to research whether their jurisdiction has something similar to an unexplained wealth order, and if not, why not? And likewise, if they're on the statute book, but they're not being used, ask the question, why? And what can I do to change that? Now, as we know, corruption is a phenomenon which every jurisdiction has to grapple with, and organised criminals exist in every corner of the world, and they become ever more creative in the ways they hide their ill-gotten gains. So we need to be better at preventing them from doing it, catching them when they do, and taking back the money they stole. So putting all of this in a bit of context, why does it matter? It matters because the World Bank estimates that businesses and individuals every year pay 1.5 trillion US dollars in bribes. Now that corresponds to 2% of global GDP, which is a staggering sum of money. And just some other facts and figures that when you reel them off, they're a bit mind-blowing. So 9.5 trillion US dollars is spent annually on public sector contracts and large public investment projects, and public procurement alone accounts for up to 1/4 of all public spending globally. Now, bearing in mind that corruption adds up to 25% or 1/4 of the cost of procurement contracts in developing countries, you start to get an idea of the size of the problem, particularly in the field of public procurement and big public works. I think the latest estimate is that corruption adds up to 10% of the cost of doing business globally. So just think what things we could achieve if we weren't having to pay all of that extra money. Now, in Africa, it's obviously an estimate. It's very difficult to be accurate with these figures, but I think the World Bank has estimated that there's been such significant capital flight over the last 30 years or so. It's something in the region of $500 billion that's been stolen and sent abroad, which is a staggering amount of money. And we all know that ultimately corruption costs lives, it costs people's well-being, their jobs, and their education. It exacerbates inequitable wealth distribution, as well as social and identity-related divisions. It fuels conflict and instability, and it emboldens non-state armed groups. I do a fair bit of work in Somalia, and you only have to look at the way in which corruption influences the dynamics there to see just what a powerful impact corruption can have. It also exacerbates the unequal power dynamics between men and women, limiting women's access to public resources, information, and decision-making, and often in nations where women don't get a fair shake of the stick anyway. Now, certain forms of corruption, such as sexual extortion and petty corruption, are a particularly heavy burden for women, and we need to bear this in mind when we're programming. And obviously, corruption has detrimental effects in many respects. It undermines the government's ability to serve public interests, and it erodes the public trust in political processes, thereby undermining democracy. So in this context, every Kenyan shilling that flows from Kenya, and I use Kenya as an example because it's where I live at the moment, from Kenya to another jurisdiction, is a missed opportunity to treat the ill, provide safe drinking water and adequate sanitation, to educate children, and so on. And as is always the case, the worst consequences of corruption are borne by poor, marginalized, and vulnerable people. Now, you can't deliver a webinar these days without making reference to the COVID pandemic, which is almost certainly one of the reasons why we're doing this over the internet rather than speaking in person. And one of the consequences of the pandemic is that huge sums of money have been sent to deal with the problem, but huge sums of money have also been lost to corruption. And in fact, the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, actually said, any type of corruption is unacceptable. However, corruption related to PPE, that's personal protective equipment, is actually murder. Now, they're very strong words, but PPE and other medical equipment that should have been procured during emergency COVID funding, but wasn't because of corruption, unquestionably jeopardizes lives. And I've been involved in working with the Kenya Medical Supplies Authority, KEMSA, which has been embroiled in a huge COVID-related funding scandal, such that tens of millions of US dollars are thought to have gone missing, and PPE that should have been procured for hospitals throughout Kenya, not just in Nairobi, hasn't materialized, and it's caused a lot of consternation here in Kenya. Now, obviously, corruption and the IFFs that flow are a significant impediment to Kenya and to every African jurisdiction affected by them from achieving their SDGs or their Sustainable Development Goals. And anti-corruption is rooted in SDG 16, which is peace, justice, and effective institutions. Now, these are an enabler of the whole UN 2030 agenda. So every Sustainable Development Goal is impacted by corruption. So the Goal 16 is a target not only in its own right, but it's also a fundamental condition for making sure the other SDGs are achieved. Now, I mentioned earlier the UN Convention Against Corruption. I just want to explain briefly why it's important in this context. So UN Convention is the only legally binding universal anti-corruption instrument, and it was drafted internationally with a cooperation of experts from all over the globe, and was open for signature in 2003. And there are now 187 state parties to the convention, so it has near universal take-up. And in fact, Kenya was the first signatory to UNCAC on 9th of December 2003. There are only 2 jurisdictions in Africa that haven't ratified the convention. They are Somalia and Eritrea. Although I have been personally working quite closely with the Somali authorities of late in a bid to have the convention ratified in 2021. And just as an interesting footnote for those listening from abroad, if Somalia does ratify and we can persuade Eritrea to do the same, it will in fact mean that Africa is the only continent in which every jurisdiction has ratified the convention. By way of contrast, Europe is unlikely ever to reach that status, as there are a number of jurisdictions, and I won't name names, which refuse to ratify the treaty. I leave you to reach your own conclusions as to why some jurisdictions might be less interested in ratifying an international anti-corruption convention than others. Now, of course, signing an international treaty, while important, is just the start of the journey. It displays a commitment to improvement, but that's not the same thing as actually delivering those improvements. And it's for that reason that UNCAC has an implementation review mechanism, or IRM. Now, there's 185 separate states that participate in this, and it's led to a global overview of gaps and good practices in addressing corruption. And through the review mechanism, states' compliance with the comprehensive set of measures included in UNCAC on criminalization, law enforcement, international cooperation, which I mentioned before, asset recovery, a whole set of different things that reflect a broad collection of articles. They're all included. States are expected to report on progress made in the implementation of those recommendations from previous reviews, and where technical assistance was required, whether this assistance was readily available. Now, challenges and technical assistance needs are identified in the course of the country reviews, and the whole process is constantly under review and will be, those gaps are integrated into country programs. And it's into that framework that advisors such as me fit. So while I'm based here in Kenya, my role is regional. I'm responsible for delivering UNODC assistance across the whole of East Africa, and UNODC has regional advisors on anti-corruption in South America, South Africa, West Africa, Southeast Asia, and national advisors in numerous jurisdictions across the world. We assist states with technical and policy advice, incorporating international best practice, and of course, importantly, tailored to the national context. Now, the UN as a whole, not just UNODC, not just the Office on Drugs and Crime, now has a common position on corruption, which was announced in August of this year and issued in advance of the first ever UN General Assembly special session on corruption, which is to be held in June of 2021. It's quite important that the UNGAS, as it's called, is featuring corruption, because it will probably set the corruption agenda for the next 5-10 years. Now, the UN Common Position is a reflection of the recognition that corruption is at the heart of challenges faced by developing nations. Without addressing it, much good work, including significant international aid contributions, either come to nothing, or worse, end up in the pockets of criminals. So the UN needs to do better at mainstreaming anti-corruption best practice into its programming. And that's one of the things I've been trying to do in Somalia in particular. Now, one of the key elements of that UN Common Position is a recognition of the need to engage young people in the fight against corruption. It's sometimes said that school is 4 walls with the future inside it. And each one of those school children in every one of those classrooms around the world has the most enormous potential for good. In this context, UNODC and the corruption pillar that I run in particular has been engaged in a number of youth-focused anti-corruption activities, including a recently launched East Africa Youth Blockchain Competition, in which young tech developers have been challenged to develop blockchain-based solutions to corruption problems. And hearteningly, after only 2 weeks, we've had literally hundreds of applications from across the whole of East Africa, and the ingenuity of some of those ideas is frankly breathtaking. Now, not so long ago, those developers were those children sitting within those four walls of the classroom. Now, they're living that future. And on that note, I think I'd like to close. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, David. That was very, very insightful, and I already have a couple of questions noted down for you. But looking at time, I would like to directly hand over to our first panelist, Dr. Anya Slani, who's an associate expert at another United Nations organization, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and has been part of the team preparing the Economic Development in Africa report in 2020, which deals with the issue of illicit financial flows. Anya, I'm very happy you're here, and well, the floor is yours. Anya, microphone.
Okay, now I hope you can hear me. Thank you for the introduction, Magda, and also thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to present the Economic Development in Africa Report 2020, which was or is in this year on tackling illicit financial flows for sustainable development in Africa. And I also would like to thank David for a very good keynote speech and for already giving the motivation why UNCTAD's report is looking at illicit financial flows and why it is so important to increase research and multilateral cooperation. To give some more background on the motivation and also to have a short assessment of the numbers we look at. I want to clarify at the very beginning, and this is what David already said, it is extremely difficult to have accurate estimates of illicit financial flows for African countries. And therefore, the estimates we give cannot be taken as precise numbers, but they definitely give an idea of the problem in actual monetary terms. And so when we look at the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we have 10 more years to achieve them. And the achievement requires 4 African countries an annual 200 billion. And this is an immense amount of money. And then when we also look at the operationalization and the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, there's also an infrastructure gap, and this deficit amounts to 91 billion per year as well. And on top, due to COVID-19, there's also a fiscal vulnerability that has been exacerbated. And currently, estimates show that between 110 and 154 billion are needed to recover from its social and economic impact. However, domestic resource mobilization is undermined by capital flight, and it has already been pointed out by David. And our report, our estimates of capital flight show that each year, roughly 88.6 billion leave the African continent. And between 2000 and 2015, this even amounted to 836 billion. And when we compare this number to the total external debt stock of 770 billion in 2018, it means that Africa is actually a net creditor to the world. When we look at this in comparison to the annual inflow of foreign direct investment and official development aid, it shows that illicit capital flight is higher in recent years, and it also outpaces the inflow of financial resources. Indeed, due to measurement problems and the limitations in the data, the number of IFFs might be even higher. And here the data presented on capital flight comes from the PARI data set, and it follows the method of Indicomana and Boyce. To be more specific on the definitions of IFFs, David already said that there is no agreed definition of IFFs. In our report, we put a working definition forward. And first, on the capital flight numbers you saw in the previous slide, it represents illicit outflows that are not recorded in official government statistics. And this is calculated from the balance of payments residuals, following the method of the leading researchers in this field, Indicomana and Boyce. Overall, IFFs in the report are defined as movement of money and assets across borders that are illegal in source, transfer, or use. And because of the illicit nature of illicit financial flows, it is extremely difficult to measure them, but they also take various forms and various channels. And those challenges of measuring IFFs also differ across countries. To speak a little bit more on the definitions and the categories of IFFs, the UNODC and UNCTAD task force identified 4 main activities, and the tax and commercial practices are the main source of IFS. And according to UNECA estimates, they make up roughly 65% of illicit financial flows. And tax on commercial practices refer or over and under invoicing of trade shipments, but also abusive use of transfer pricing, for instance. And then we have other categories, illegal markets. Those include any type of illegal trafficking of goods, such as drugs and firearms, but also illicit exploitation of resources, but then also smuggling of migrants. The category of corruption, so IFFs from corruption include bribery, embezzlement, abuse of functions, and trading in influence, and so on. The fourth category refers directly to theft type and terrorism financing. So those categories also overlap, and because of different channels and actors of illicit financial flows, it is important to look at different measurements. And the this year economic report specifically focuses on the channel of trade misinvoicing in terms of the measurement. And since most countries in sub-Saharan Africa are dependent on exports of raw commodities, commercial flows related to commodities are a focal area in the study. And the estimates find that trade misinvoicing costs Africa around 30 to 52 billion US dollar every year. And through illicit extractive activities, it's roughly $40 billion that are lost. Also, we look at other sources of illicit financial flows, especially tax avoidance and the loss of taxes. So there are estimates from COPAM and also Jansky and Palansky who say that roughly 10% of Africa's corporate tax was lost to tax avoidance, and the estimate was for 2015, and that 2.5% of total tax revenue was lost to tax havens. So this is the rough overview of the measurement, and on our key findings. Relating to trade misinvoicing, we emphasize that it's an acute risk, especially for African countries, where 89% of countries are dependent on exports of raw commodities. What we find is that the patterns of export under invoicing vary by country, especially according to the commodities which are exported and the organization of the value chain. So meanwhile, the pattern of export under invoicing relates to the commodity group, and this is somehow consistent across countries. We identify that gold is by far the largest contributor, representing roughly 12%, and platinum, gold 77%, followed by diamonds 12%, and platinum of 6%. Other findings in the report. We look at the impact of illicit financial flows on sustainable development in Africa. And we conduct empirical regressions to better understand the linkages between IFFs and labor productivity, and also the interaction with institutions in channeling those impacts. And we find that IFFs are significantly associated with lower productivity. And for instance, countries that with higher illicit financial flows have on average only 1/3 of the agricultural productivity than countries with low IFFs. IFFs also mean that there's a lower level of investments, and it is a lack of government revenue. And we also conduct an empirical assessment to highlight the complexity of those linkages. And there we find by descriptive comparison that countries with high illicit financial flows on average only spend 25% less than on health less than countries with low IFF. And also for education, countries with high IFF spend 58% less. And as already been said in the keynote speech, it is especially women and girls that suffer more from the fiscal effects of IFFs, because they are the main beneficiaries of public revenues. When we look at the interlinkages and the channels, it is clear that IFFs are strongly linked to institutional capacity and poor financial sector regulation, and that there is a circular relationship. So they make not only countries more vulnerable to IFFs, but they also increase the negative impact of IFFs on sustainable development. And to give some examples of a lower institutional capacity, only 45 out of 53 African countries provide trade data to UN Comtrade in a continuous manner, and only a fraction of these participate in metadata surveys. Also, only half of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa still do not have any form of domestic transfer pricing rules, and therefore cannot challenge multinational enterprises through their local judicial authorities. Moreover, we look at the environmental linkages, because the sources of IFS highlight the magnitude of environmentally harmful activities, such as illegal mining, illegal fishing, and illegal logging. And it's one of the first approaches, kind of a novel approach to link illicit financial flows directly to environmental sustainability. And when we compare the estimate of capital flight to the annual climate change related finance needs, we see that curbing capital flight, illicit financial flows, could almost bridge half of this climate change finance needs gap. Corruption is, of course, an important factor that needs to be tackled, and it is an enabler of illicit financial flows. And when we look at the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative database, there we see that a total for Africa, only 1.5 billion has been recovered and returned, according to this database. And it is a very small number compared to the immense amount of capital flight. From our findings, we draw some policy recommendations, which we structure around 4 pillars: the economic, social, environmentally, and institutional. It is clear that tackling illicit financial flows must include multilateral cooperation and also strengthening the regulatory framework at the domestic level. First, the fight against corruption and money laundering must be intensified. So, for instance, the recovery of stolen assets, but then also the regional cooperation, such as the Intergovernmental Action Group Against Money Laundering in West Africa, but also other regions in Africa, should be encouraged. Second, African countries should also be encouraged to implement and join the recommendations from the extractive industry transparency initiatives to make resource governance more transparent. Third, an improvement in regional cooperation on tax reform is necessary, and stronger engagement in international taxation reforms, and also a closer cooperation of African countries in the mining sector, or taxing in the mining sector. Then fourth, and this has already been mentioned by David, whenever there is some kind of persistent gap, for us it's especially the gap in the trade data. If researchers or national authorities find such a wide gap, it should be a red flag for further investigation. And therefore, one of the key recommendations of our report is to collect more and better trade data to detect the risks related to IFS. To be also on the social side, we know addressing IFS is a matter of ethics, and in order to tackle illicit financial flows and to uncover suspicious transactions, it is necessary to protect civil society and whistleblowers and investigative journalists. For institutions, overall, the domestic regulatory frameworks must be strengthened to uncover suspicious transactions and to fight corruption. And also on the institutional side, the investment in data and infrastructure, and there UNCTAD plays an important role to support countries, for instance, by the ACWECA trade data. Also, on the institutional side, we emphasize that it's important to engage multinational economies on responsible taxing and on reporting on the Sustainable Development Goals. This is especially relevant for the environmental impact of extractive industries. And so there must also be an engagement of enterprises on the taxation. And further on the environmental side, we encourage further research on the linkages between illicit financial flows and climate change. I stop here, and for further information, please refer to this website, and I think further topics we can address in the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Anja. And I would like, again, I have a couple of questions that I would like to address. We'll see how many questions there will be during the Q&A. But now I would like to point to a different perspective, and that is the perspective of Khadija Sharif, who is Africa editor for the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. She's also a board member of the African Whistleblower Organization. at the platform for the protection of African whistleblowers, and Yale Poynter Fellow as well. And she's going to share, and I'm especially happy about this because this is something I have not been in touch with so far. She's going to share her perspective from her work on well, corruption, tax evasion, and illicit financial flows with us. Khadija, the floor is yours, and looking forward to hear your talk.
Thank you. It's always good to go after very impressive people because then others can go for bathroom breaks and make coffee and so forth. So I'm the bathroom break person, if anybody needs it. In my job, we often focus on the illegal, the corrupt, and the criminal, but we find that the systemic fault lines that make this possible, is legally grafted onto certain systems. So to protect the illicit system or even the illegal system, they outsource it from here where it's wrong to elsewhere where it's fine. And that's one of the biggest problems. So I just want to go a little bit back in time where we can see that with the Rosetta Stone, in ancient Egypt, we all know it was a terrible time for slavery. The scribes at that time were the lawyers, and the priests who oversaw the nation's resources were the bankers. So they quite literally ran these temples of finance. And the Rosetta Stone, which is a famous artifact, was basically the priests writing the rules for the monarchs and the military and granting them financial privileges, including tax exemptions for the priests and their own temples. So the economy was held hostage in a very technically legal way, even if it was unjust and wrong. And it privileged the elites, and it sustained the inequities and inequalities in a way that's not much different from today. So as today we have these very complex financial languages of derivatives and collateralizations and so forth, we find that that was the language almost of the priests. They published it in hieroglyphics, they published it in Greek, the language of the administration, and also in Demotic, which was the language of the people. And they did it quite literally in stone to say, these are the rules, we back the monarchs, and these are the privileges given to those who occupy the upper parts of society. So once a year, when their bodies were broken, creating wealth for the elites in a very regressive tax and financial system, the temples would then give charity to the people. And again, there's a lot of parallels with the modern day world where you see philanthropy and easy virtue systems like the Kimberley process coming to the fore, where countries can ratify things, but who is really sanctioned, who goes to prison, which bad companies lose their licenses for violating human rights and raping the ecologies of countries. We don't see that very often. So while there's a lot of positive things that appear to be happening linked to transparency, when you're an investigative journalist, you live in the cracks and you actually see the fault lines of the system, and that this kind of easy virtue doesn't have a tangible and legal impact that holds them accountable. So transparency and accountability are two very different things, and we need to start reconsidering the benchmarks that we use. When OCCRP did an investigation into Gambia, the missing billion that we found, which was just a fraction of what the Jammeh dictatorship had taken, we saw that the bulk of it was actually, if not illegal, it was legal but technically legal. Sovereign systems like the Gambian regime, Belgian, Switzerland, various corporations operating in the UK and the US, even major banks based in New York like Citibank, allowed for a lot of illegality to happen because it was coded in a way that legally privileged those sending and receiving money, those that held sovereign political powers. So we had the repurposing of the Central Bank of the Gambia. We had illegal money flowing into the country as foreign investment from sanctioned actors like Hezbollah. We had Citibank handling tens of millions in stolen donor aid because President Jammeh legally requested it. We had a monopoly on oil between Total and Hezbollah that literally controlled the Gambian economy, but again, it was made technically legal. So the only thing that was outright illegal was the deforestation of Casamance, a lot of very rare rosewood that was worth $350 million that we could find. But because the ecology has no rights, and the land was only valued at $1 per hectare, the rainforest land, it wasn't really considered stolen wealth until it was commodified and stole on the market. So it skirted illegality because the ecology in which human life is intertwined didn't really have many legal rights. And money, the 88 billion that we see leaving the continent, this is the fraction of real wealth because we don't recognize the value of water, of arable land. We look at the value of a fish as instead of, the ocean, which is needed in order for that system to continue. So real value is being lost from Africa in ways that are not being financially accounted for. But if it was financially accounted, the market would use cost-benefit analysis, and Africa's value would then be legally commodified at a very low cost. So again, the continent would lose out in a big way. Money just reflects what the market rate is. It doesn't really reflect the value of what is being lost. And if I go back to just my own life during apartheid, the whole system was legal. We had Coca-Cola, a very bad company making money in the country. And when activists said that Coca-Cola shouldn't operate in apartheid South Africa, they moved to Swaziland, where one of Africa's last and worst monarchs live. Right now, Coca-Cola provides over 50% of that country's tax revenue. And the concentrate made in that country is exported all over the world. Coca-Cola is able to internally impute a value to its so-called intangible asset. And in that way, they have profit shifted $33 billion to the Cayman Island and avoided paying $11.5 billion in taxes, while propping up a very corrupt regime that's trying to dissolve its parliament, that kills activists, and that has oppressed the media from ever exposing the kind of kickbacks and theft of ecology and of governance that's involved. So when we think about illegal proceeds of crime, very often it is entwined with terribly respectable actors, and it's almost always legal because it's backed by different decentered sovereign states. It's backed coercively by the law. And until secrecy jurisdictions are shut down, until intangible assets are valued externally and not internally by companies, and a number of other things, we're never really going to get to the heart of how much of value is being lost and the true character of illicit activities. So I'll just stop there, but we know that at any time, if people shut down during the apartheid era, 85% of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange was controlled by one company, Anglo-American. They mined the gold and the diamonds, and that was actually the reason why the British colonized the country, because they wanted to access the diamond and the gold that had been discovered in the mid-1800s. The Congress of Vienna allocated South Africa to the British, and they paid the Dutch £6 million. And we know once again that the value of money is just fictional because the Dutch East India Company minted their own coin. They could basically create as much money as they wanted to colonize territories and enslave people. So if we think about the long history and the legacy of illicit financial activity, from the Gambia to Citibank in New York, enabling it, to the history of colonialism and apartheid, all the way back to ancient Egypt, we see that while we are focusing on limited definitions of the corrupt, the illegal, and the criminal, a lot of the times it's legally grafted, it's backed by different sovereign states, whether it's secrecy jurisdictions or powerful economies like the US and the UK that make money from these corporations that are literally raiding ecologies. We see that the heart of the system is not so much a problem of the illegal, but a problem of what we have allowed to become legal, how we have valued what is wealth, and what we are losing in the process of this. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kadisha. You've given, at least me, I think, us some food for thought about how our financial and economic system is designed in a way that enables and maybe calls for certain flows, right? That are not considered illicit or illegal. Now, I would like to, I'm pretty much picking up on that. I would like to hand over to our last speaker. And our last speaker is Fernando Saldivar, who has a background in history and economics, in particular law, and is a global policy and advocacy officer at the Jesuit Justice and Ecology Office of Africa, so JENA, in also Nairobi. And he's going to talk about the needed global normative or ethical framework to stop IFFs and corruption. And maybe he's going to well, pick up some of what you said. Fernando, please go ahead and welcome.
Thank you. I think where I want to begin this afternoon is by situating this conversation that we've been having about IFFs and all of its different aspects that we've heard from each one of these panelists in a very different way. But as I hope that you've all been able to see, you know, it's almost like an onion. As we peel back one layer, we see more and more and more, and the problem almost seems insurmountable. But what I want to do is to situate this conversation about illicit financial flows into a broader discussion of the ethical and moral foundations of the global financial order. Specifically, why it's important for the Catholic Church to be addressing this issue, and why this has become really a centerpiece of Pope Francis's vision for our common future as human beings, in human beings that inhabit in common this very small, very fragile planet. And across the board, there's a tendency when it comes to matters of politics and economics to want to tell the church to mind its own business, to stick to what it knows best, or as we might say in the US, to stay in your own lane, to leave this to the policymakers, to the economists, to the academics, to all of those different people, and to do what we do on our own. In effect, to render unto Caesar those things that are Caesar's, and unto God those things that are God's. And this is most definitely not one of those things that belongs to God. But particularly in the Pope Francis era, discussion of the economy, of our political structures, is at the heart of what the church is called to in accompanying people in their everyday lives. And the church, in fact, has long recognized that among its primary duties is the responsibility to call everybody across the board, albeit with a sense of humility, to clear ethical principles. And that is no less true for those areas where politics and economics apply. And that's particularly the case now as we begin to think about the post-pandemic world, as we recognize the social, economic, and political devastation that COVID-19 wrought across the world. And we ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to create in its wake? Because there is a window of opportunity right now to radically rethink the moral and ethical paradigm on which the global financial order rests. And I don't use that term lightly. I'm not throwing out the word radical just to get a rise out of the audience. Instead, there's a meaning behind that. And the meaning is that it's a challenge. It's a challenge for all of us in our respective ways, in our respective fields, to be bold in our thinking, to be open to new ideas and new voices. And we've heard those today in recommendations and tangible things that can and in a sense must be done. And it's also the humility to realize that we're going to make mistakes along the way, but it's a willingness to try. It's a willingness to challenge our leaders, to challenge our policymakers to take bold action in response to the devastation that COVID-19 has wrought across the world. And what the church can do, the special role that it can play in all of this, is help to articulate the reasons why these changes should be a policy priority, to give that framework, that background that politicians in Africa and in the global north can take back to their constituencies and say, these are the reasons why things need to change. These are the reasons why the old order doesn't work anymore. And it's It's that conviction that the old way of thinking no longer works, that we've heard across the board, not only from Pope Francis, but from the Dalai Lama, from Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, from people and individuals at every rung of society, that COVID-19 has been an economic wake-up call. And what the church can do is help to articulate the ethical basis on why things should change. So then the next question is, how do we go about that? What's the paradigm that Pope Francis and the Catholic Church offer in response? And if we look at recent history, actually from the beginning of his pontificate, Pope Francis has in fact been inviting all of us to envision what he calls a different kind of economy, one that brings life, not death, one that's inclusive, not exclusive, humane and not dehumanizing, one that cares for the environment and doesn't despoil it. And as part of that vision, in 2019, Pope Francis called for a conference that was originally going to take place in Assisi, Italy, in March of this year. And it was to be entitled The Economy of Francesco. And the idea was that he would bring together young economists, entrepreneurs, and other change makers from all across the world to sit down together and to enter into a covenant among themselves to change today's economy and to, in a sense, give a soul and a vision to the economy of tomorrow. And although the COVID-19 pandemic and the travel restrictions that came about resulted in the March event not taking place, it's been rescheduled now to take place in November of this year. And although COVID-19 has been a bit of a, if you will, a speed bump in this process, the desire, the motivation on the Pope Francis to push ahead is still there. And although the Pope draws his inspiration from his namesake, from St. Francis of Assisi, the vision that underlies the economy of Francesco is really entirely his own. It's a critique of global capitalism that draws upon his own unique background as not only the first Jesuit Pope, but the first Pope to come from the global South. And that's a vision of what the church in the 21st century can be. And it's informed by his own background, by his own pastoral formation in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, of his experience of having been a bishop in Latin America, of all the talk and reception that went on throughout his entire life, really, about how to receive the documents of Vatican II and the vision that came from that. And what that really the basis of that is a social vision that incarnates the church's preferential option for the poor and how it calls us to accompany those on the world's margins, the poor, the dispossessed, the voiceless, and to give them their dignity as human beings that are created in the image and likeness of God. And this vision of what the world could and should be was first developed and articulated really in his 2015 encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si, in what he called integral ecology, his understanding that everything is closely related and that today's problems, the problems that we're facing right now, call for a vision that's capable of taking into account every aspect of the crisis, the economic, the social, the cultural, and yes, the financial. And that's the premise of the economy of Francesco, an understanding that everything that we've heard today, everything that we've discussed is closely related, and that we can't discuss poverty, conflict, climate change, or even the economy in isolation. Like the onion I was talking about in the beginning, all of these layers are connected at their root. And to deal with these problems, we have to have a holistic global vision. So back to the beginning, where do illicit financial flows fit into this way of thinking about the economy? What's their place in the economy of Francesco? And for part of that answer, what we can do is turn to the Pope's most recent encyclical, the one that's about 2 weeks old, Fratelli Tutti, his encyclical on human fraternity, where again, he draws upon the premise of integral ecology, that everything is interconnected. And from that premise, that if everything is interconnected, then the follow-up question is, if that's the case, then what is my duty to you, to your family, to your children, to your country, and to their future? And one of the ways that he very beautifully paints this, of what our duties are to each other, is through the parable of the Good Samaritan. And it's a parable that is really one of our global cultural treasures now. It's not just limited to the Christian world. It's something that's in our cultural vernacular, if you will. The image of the man who's lying on the side of the road, beaten, broken, left for dead, the man so desperately in need, and yet everybody passes by, the people in power, the priest, the Levite, those who would be expected and have the resources to do something, walk right on by. And who is it that comes to this man's aid and tends his wounds? The Samaritan, the one who in this culture is looked down upon, who nothing is expected from. He is the one who looks at this man in dire need and is able to say, that's my neighbor. I need to take the time, the effort, and do what I can to help. And what Pope Francis calls us to in this encyclical is to put ourselves into the spot of the Good Samaritan, to identify with the vulnerability of others, to identify with those throughout the world who are so desperately in need, and to see them as our neighbors. And he challenges us and says that this parable, this story that we're all so familiar with, can serve as a criterion for judging every economic, political, social, and religious project. That every day we have to decide for ourselves whether or not to be good Samaritans, or whether we're going to be indifferent, whether we're going to be those that just walk on by. And this can be the way that we think about the economy, realizing that our neighbors, our brothers and sisters throughout the world, as somebody who comes from the global north, are harmed by the decisions that we make there, that my comfort, my financial well-being comes at their expense. And tangibly, how these structural injustices manifest themselves are in the form of illicit financial flows. We've heard today from each one of our panelists the ways that all of these work together to inhibit progress towards the SDGs, to inhibit progress towards poverty reduction, that tax evasion, tax avoidance, money laundering, human trafficking, corruption, and all its guises are the roadblocks that we face in all of the vision that was laid out in the SDGs, everything that we were trying to do collectively before COVID, and has now been made that much more difficult by the pandemic. And why is this a moral and ethical issue? Why is this something that we should be concerned with in a normative framework? Why is this something that we should take action against? Because of what we've seen in Africa, because of what we've seen in the global South, in how COVID-19 was a wake-up call as to the extent of the damage that IFFs have wrought. The fact that all of the capital, all of the outflow that had gone out from the continent that could have otherwise gone towards infrastructure, health, education, services, transportation, all of those things that we saw were in critical, dire need as the pandemic broke out, that simply were not here. That people are dead today who would not otherwise have been had those resources been available and had they been used and utilized in an open, transparent manner. That's the crisis. That's what we're trying to address. And I think we shy away from this as a moral and ethical issue. And I think what we've seen today, what we've heard, is that it's something that we can't shy away from. That if we're going to make this a policy priority across the board, not just in Africa itself, but in the global north, in the US, in Europe, then the ethical argument, the moral argument has to be a key part of it. And I think we see it already in the way that, that our societies are talking about this malaise, talking about this crisis in global ethics, in the way that we think about the economy broadly. It's already there. And I think it's already young people who are having this conversation, millennials, in fact, who see all of this and are beginning to ask quite openly, is this all that there is? Is all that I have to look forward to financial? Is it a question of money? And I think what we've seen, what the message of COVID-19 has been, is that money alone can't save you. It won't save you. All the people in the West, particularly in the US, where the debate has been, we need to save the economy. We can't be locked down. Money, money, money. It's all about the stock market. It's all about the financial benefits, in a way where you can have it as cravenly put as it was by the Texas Attorney General, who said, we can sacrifice our grandparents, but we have to save the economy. And people across the world are saying there's got to be something more. Because if that in fact is the moral paradigm, if that in fact is what we're looking at, then the result is that the global north can say, we can sacrifice Africa for our economy. And what the economy of Francesco, what Catholic social teaching has to offer to this conversation is a bold, emphatic rejection of that we are all interconnected. We are brothers and sisters, and we are called on a global level to treat each other accordingly. In closing, I'd like to read to you a short passage from Fratelli Tutti, just to paint again, just the imperative of the role that the church can play in this. And it goes as follows. For these reasons, the church, while respecting the autonomy of political life, does not restrict her mission to the private sphere. On the contrary, she cannot and must not remain on the sidelines in the building of a better world, or fail to reawaken the spiritual energy that can contribute to the betterment of society. Those are our marching orders. And it's precisely why the church is called to offer its critique of the global economy at this particular moment, in this particular place, and invite all people of goodwill across the board to join us in this endeavor. Thank you for letting me speak to you this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Fernando. This is actually something that is very much in line with many of my students' thoughts. Now I have a couple of questions here as we're moving to the question and answers part, and I would like to go in chronological order, and I would like to ask them to specific people that I think are the right respondent or the best respondent, but everybody else I would like to ask you to contribute in this and maybe open some sort of discussion. And the first question that we have I have here is by Janet Adeokun. The question is, in Nigeria, it's being really difficult in dealing with IFFs. My question is, how can I, as a young person, push harder to create more awareness in this aspect, especially in the northern part of Nigeria, where I live, being faced with constant security challenges. So it's very much a question about what can young people do. And I think, David, you have been talking about this a little bit, and you have been working with young people on particular this question, so maybe you would like to try to give an answer. I'm not sure if there is a good answer to that.
No, I'll certainly give it a bash. So we've been doing a number of different things in the sort of youth corruption interface. One of which is the blockchain hackathon, which I mentioned in the course of my speech. Now, I don't know whether the lady asking the questions is into tech development. It's not something that I can say is on my CV. But you know, I've been looking into it, and it does offer a lot of opportunity. And the response that we've had from not just young developers in Kenya, but across the whole of East Africa, really has been quite remarkable. In 2 weeks, we've had 150 plus solid applications. You know, people have really given some thought about how their tech skills could be put to use to fight corruption. And so there's obviously a lot of interest in this, not just in Kenya, but across the whole of East Africa. In fact, we've actually had some young developers from Nigeria write to us and say, can we enter the competition, please? And so we're giving serious thought to opening up, in fact, making it continent-wide in due course. We can't at the moment, we don't have the funding for that, but we would love to, because, you know, we've had a lot of people come forward. We've had some from South Africa, some from North Africa. So yeah, the word has spread. We do also something which you may be seeing in due course across Africa, which is engaging with something called the African Young Parliamentarians Network. And so there's something called, sorry, that's ibis you can hear flying over the house, one of the hazards of living in rural Nairobi. So there's African Young Parliamentarians Network is a group of young African parliamentarians who are particularly keen on fighting corruption. It was formed as a result of the Kenya Young Parliamentarians Association, which again is a group of young MPs who are committed to this, and they wanted to do something Africa-wide. We are supporting the African Young Parliamentarians Network, and you'll see a lot more about them over the coming 6 to 12 months. And I would certainly encourage you to engage on that front. There's an MP from Nigeria whose name I can supply to you in a moment, and he's actually part of the network. Just bear with me. I'll provide that on the group chat later rather than delay the answer. And so I do think there's a lot of scope. Now, whistleblowing is something which you may want to think about. I heard Khadija talk about the importance of this, and I would echo what she has to say. In fact, one of the categories for the competition that we've asked people to write in about is how we effectively protect whistleblowers. It's obviously important that whistleblowers are protected, that if they see corrupt activity or they see activity that they consider to be immoral, illegal, illicit, whatever. Kenya, for example, doesn't actually have any whistleblowing protection law. And so one of the things we've been doing through the Kenya Young Parliamentarians Association is pushing Parliament to pass a bill to make that happen. So it has practical real world effects when you engage with these associations, or at least I like to think so. And so I would certainly encourage you to look to see what I know is quite a vibrant civil society in Nigeria, and see how you can engage most effectively with them. And I'd certainly encourage you to look at the UNODC website to see some of the things that we do in Nigeria. We have quite a large office there, and I'd encourage you to get in touch with them. I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully a little, if not all of it.
Okay. Thank you a lot. The next question I have would go to Anya. It's a similar direction, but more on an institutional level. So the question is, or the comment is, you talked about how corruption facilitates IFF and weakens the institution in this vicious circles, and how come corruption has become like a perennial issue in most parts of Africa. As policy recommendation, you talked about increasing transparency, but what can you suggest as practical steps to achieve transparency? Again, a question rather difficult to answer, but maybe you can provide some insights on practical steps.
Yes, thank you. I'm happy. I think I can say something on the practical steps based on our research. But let me start on why corruption is such a problem and why high levels of corruption are an institutional problem. So we see it that it is the weak institutional capacity to enforce the rule of law, and therefore it makes corruption more easier, and the low transparency also in economic and financial transactions kind of hide corruption, and so the same as they hide the proceeds of crime. And of course also conflict and political instability help for corruption, and this comes to the policy recommendations, why it is important to improve or achieve higher transparency. And this brings me to the second question. Transparency and accountability. The first policy recommendation that came from our report, especially regarding the extractive industries, is that adopting the extractive industry transparency initiative can help to improve transparency. And there are some recommendations such as a beneficial ownership register, where it's more transparent which companies engage and how also the value chain somehow is organized in the sector. And then it is simply, I think, also what we have here in this webinar, the public debate, and to acknowledge the problem and to make clear that it is a problem, and sometimes it's it might not even be clear to everyone. And then we also have recommendations of making tax revenues more transparent, with that also making data availability, or especially government actions, more transparent, and therefore collecting data is one of the key instruments to achieve transparency. And some kind of long-term policy recommendation or something that can achieve higher transparency is higher education and literacy, because if the population, or I won't give a number because I don't have an exact number now, let's say 30% of the population is illiterate, then if they cannot read the documents or the data, then of course it's also not transparent what happens with the resources and where are maybe suspicious transactions and suspicious money laundering cases. And then it adds, of course, to what David said, and very encouraging engagement they have to achieve transparency and to engage the population and the people on this matter. So maybe I stop here, and because I think other panelists will also have some policy recommendations on that. Thank you.
There is a related, somewhat related discussion going on about transparency in the webinar chat. So I'm trying to follow all of it. And there has been the question whether it would be possible to establish, or could be a solution to establish, a central repository of information about corruption, where basically everybody, so all Africans or any other countries, if established in other continents or countries, could report what they witness or encounter, and this would make it much easier for people like Khadija to develop a rich and detailed picture of the Pan-African network of corruption. And I think David is super busy responding to things. So maybe David, you could respond to this in a bigger setting, so to everybody else.
Sure. Yes, I'll pause writing my other reply to a different question. Hang on, where were we? So, yeah, I mean, I like the idea of. Let me just start with you. I like the idea of having a central repository of information, so that people like Khadija and others who want to extract patterns from that data. My concern would be, and it's the concern that I expressed in my text answer, is that the moment that you try and gather data in that way, you run the real risk of it leaking. And, you know, I used to, a long time ago before I joined the UN, I used to be the head of legal for a government department that investigated miscarriages of justice in the UK. And so we had to deal with some extremely sensitive information that came from not only the police, but from the intelligence services as well. And the protocols that we had to have in place just to ensure that that kind of information was kept only to those people who needed to see it were pretty extraordinary. And that was a relatively small organization of 100 people dealing with relatively small amounts of data. All you would need for this to be a major problem is one leak of one name and somebody dies, and it would be a major issue, I think. I mean, clearly Khadija is doing a great job without the central repository, though I suspect it would make her life an awful lot easier if she had it. Certainly one of the things that can be done, it's not quite the same sort of information, but one of the things that can be done is to go to, and I know it sounds like I'm plugging you on ODC, but there is a lot of information on the website. There's a huge amount of information that we gather on a very regular basis about each and every jurisdiction that is a signatory to the convention. And I made the point, and I think it's an important one. Simply signing or ratifying a convention is all very well, but at the end of the day, it's a piece of paper. It doesn't actually mean that much. What matters is how you implement, at the rate at which you implement, and whether you implement with proper political will. And one of the things that the review mechanism looks at is just how effective that implementation is. We don't rank people in the way that, for example, OECD does or FATF do. You know, we're not talking about a transparency index where Somalia regularly comes 180th out of 180 countries in terms of corruption rating, and I know how much that irritates the Somalis because I deal with them on a regular basis. We don't do it that way, but there is a huge amount of information on there which could be interrogated because some of it is quite basic, the things that people aren't doing, the things that people could do. So Kenya doesn't have a whistleblowing law. There is no law in Kenya that protects reporting persons or whistleblowers, and that you can find that out simply by going on the UNODC website. So there's lots of information out there. I don't think a central repository is the solution, is the short answer.
Okay, thank you. I think you mentioned a very important thing, which is proper political will, which is also very relevant, which brought me to the question, is anything of any use really if some countries lack companies or countries, if there's a lack of political will or political power against big multinational companies, for example, if that isn't present. So do you think some sort of coordination, collaboration in terms of data, in terms of, well, anything would be the solution or a way to go, and how could this be achieved?
Well, certainly better international cooperation is, I think, the foundation of all of this. And I say that as someone who used to be a prosecutor as well. A long time ago, I used to be a criminal defense practitioner as well. So I've seen all sides of the coin. And as someone who used to prosecute cases, particularly those with an international flavor, the need for international cooperation is huge. You just cannot get the job done without it. And ultimately, what we want to see are corporations prosecuted. And I know sometimes there's a feeling that these things don't happen, but you have to remember that Siemens were subject to the most enormous fine about 10-15 years ago, because effectively doing international business for Siemens a few years ago meant bribery. And they were engaged in whole-scale bribery across most of the globe where their operations were. But they've paid the price now. They've paid an enormous price for that, and they're restructuring and have restructured. In fact, some of the projects that I'm engaged with here in Kenya, which are connected to academia in Kenya, Pakistan, and Mexico, and looking at integrity modules for lecturers, are funded by the Siemens Corporation. It's part of their reparation funding for the things that they were engaged in. Obviously, political will is vital to all of this, and that's one of the reasons why we are engaged with the Young Parliamentarians Association, because we've found a bunch of MPs who are keen on this, and they can put pressure, not only put pressure, but do more active things. So I talked to you a moment ago about the whistleblowing bill. There was one drafted in Kenya in 2016, but it basically died a death in cabinet because no one was that interested. So when we approached the young parliamentarians, they said, okay, we can see how important this is. We'll draft our own bill, put it forward as a private member's bill. And they're now at the budget committee stage. So we're supporting them, slightly innovative approach, I admit, but we're supporting them to get that pushed through Parliament. And not only that, to actually implement it once it's through. So yeah, political will, absolutely vital, but there are different ways of looking at it and different ways of squaring the circle, if you like.
Thank you. Now I will stop taking over this this webinar. And there's another question which says, what's the best way to put pressure on extractive companies that cause negative externalities to locals? I'm not sure who's the best fit to answer this. Anya, maybe you have done some work about it, but anybody else? Also very much for your input.
Yes, maybe I can give a few comments on what we found, or our recommendations, where we saw negative impacts of some extractive industries and the potential negative impact on the environment. And there, for us, it's a gap in business modeling and also modeling the environmental impact. So there's a recommendation that when we are able to measure the environmental impact in a better way, then we can also include this into the business model and into the contracts with extractive or companies in the extractive sector to have a share of their responsibility in terms of taxes, and also in terms of some of the payments they do directly to the government. And another way to increase their engagement, or to increase the or to reduce the negative externalities, is better reporting on the environmental goals, also on the SDG. It's not just about the environment, it's also about the social impacts on local societies. And there are indeed a few initiatives that try to increase the transparency of public and private sector projects in industries to measure the impact of private sector engagement on the SDGs. And those are two of the key elements I found very important.
Okay, thank you. And is there, I just need to open, oh, Fernando, yes.
Yeah, if I could add something to that too.
Yes, of course.
One of the additional areas to put pressure, particularly on extractive industries, is by pressuring institutional investors to develop ESG investing principles that directly address these particular issues. And I think because if you deal with what turns out to be a relatively limited number of major institutional investors, you can directly get the attention of these companies. And we've seen cases where corporate behavior is affected by how, when, and if certain major investors will invest. So I think it's important for those of us who are interested in these particular things to also be part of the conversation going on, particularly in the US and Europe, about what ESG investing principles, environmental, social, and governance investment will look like, and also what reporting standards are going to look like. So I think, again, that's a very tangible way for those who are interested in making changes along these lines to jump directly into the conversation.
If I could also just intervene, the World Bank's Wealth of Nations report shows that very often there's a net deficit in value where resources are extracted because countries are just not getting value for the resources, excluding the externalities. So the question of whether resources should be extracted from countries that are under authoritarian regimes or anti-democratic regimes, or when one dominant political party has ruled a country for 30 years is also a key question, because the citizens of that country are not going to get much value from the extraction of the resources. The sale of the resources may not be negotiated transparently or in good faith. And 99% of multinationals never disclose country-by-country reporting, showing how subsidiaries or affiliated companies declare profits and losses, where they pay their employees, and all of the various costs involved. They extract massive exemptions just for bringing FDI into a country, which almost immediately is circulated right back out. So does it make sense a lot of the times to even extract the so-called mineral resources or timber and so forth? Is it always the case that land that is not developed for export or commercial purposes is not being used? In Africa, we find a lot of the times that it is being used. It's just not being used for foreign direct investment purposes. So the very modeling on which political economies are constructed needs to be reconsidered as to whether it is viable and legitimate for the citizenry now and in the future or not.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There has been now a lot going on in the chat. Oh, yes. But I think, yes, I think there are no more questions in the chat. There's one more question that I'm just answering privately right now. Having said this and looking at the time, I would like to thank all of you for participating, for speaking, for providing us insight into your work and to your opinions and your findings, and everybody else who has participated by asking questions and by joining us here in providing some starting point, discussing an issue which has not sufficiently been discussed so far, I think. And also I would like to thank very much Charles for inviting everybody. And well, looks like you want to say something, so I'm just going to hand over to you. And well, it was my pleasure of moderating this talk and listening to all.